So should we be learning from others or should they be learning from us? The answer is absolutely both. Every single one of us needs people ahead of us to watch and people behind watching us, but all of this should be God's people in the direction of God's purpose. This is what we're going to explore with Moses and Joshua today. So I want to encourage you, we're going to be in a bunch of scriptures. Grab those notes, grab somebody to watch alongside you or invite them to watch even from another location so you can chat about this later. But we're going to dive into what it looks like to follow well and lead well. Here we go. Today we're jumping into another round of a series called Shoulder to Shoulder, like getting next to some great people and going after some things that really matter. And so I want to begin this way today. A friend of mine once asked me when my parents were coming into town if he could meet them. And as soon as he did, he met my dad, and one of his opening lines was, "Listen, I just want to get a PhD in my friend Drew." And then he started peppering him with questions, beginning with, "What's the most embarrassing thing Drew's ever done?" And I'm like, classic, all right? But what I appreciate about that was he and I are on kind of a journey in God's direction together, doing things that matter. He is a guy that I'm shoulder to shoulder with, and I just appreciated his intentionality and desire to know what has shaped this person who I call friend. And so let me just ask you, if someone wanted to get a PhD in you, who would they have to meet? What kind of question would they need to ask to really understand how you have become who you are today? My guess is there's a list, and that some of them are like supremely positive and helpful. There might be some people along the way who showed up in your life really poorly, and that has influenced and shaped the way that you are. But make no mistake, we are in many ways the result of the interactions and relationships that we have had. We are shaped by the people we spend time with. And so thinking about who we are shoulder to shoulder with, thinking about the people that we take a journey with. In fact, we do interviews around here. There's a very small part of the people you interact with are our paid staff. And when we interview them, we often talk about the airplane test. Are you familiar with the airplane test? If you interview someone and you can't imagine sitting next to them on a plane for 3 hours, you probably shouldn't hire them. Right? Who do we journey with that's going to shape us? I had the joy of sitting down this week. I traveled to Nashville, and a number of other friends of mine did as well. 2 of them I had met when they were 16 years old. They were in a student ministry that I was a volunteer in for a time and then would join the staff. Another was a volunteer in that staff who would eventually come on our staff. And anyway, we've journeyed for the last 15 plus years together, and we sat down to dinner. Here's a picture of my guys. From left to right, this is Eddie. Listen, when some... I wish I had time to tell you stories about Eddie. His opening line when the youth pastor before me was leaving, everybody's crying and sad because this guy was an amazing guy who was one of the guys that shaped me. And it was just a sad moment with a bunch of teenagers around. He was saying, "Listen, I'm going to go somewhere different. I'm really going to miss you." Awkward, long silence, and Eddie's opening line was, "What are you going to do with your weight set?" Like, not the time, Eddie, not the time. He's an amazing guy. This guy, Mike Harris, he was way interested in beating me in basketball, and I hold it over his head that he never did, even though he's better than me. And Michael Cooper was on our staff for a time, but here's the deal. We were sitting there, and we were reminiscing over the last 15 years. 4 hours in that booth eating dinner wasn't enough. Another hour of overtime afterwards talking about the things that God is doing in our life. When you journey shoulder to shoulder with people who shape who you become, some of them who have been ahead of you and have influenced you, some who have been right on your heels, who you get to watch God's work in your life make its way into their life. These kind of partnerships, this kind of shoulder-to-shoulder journey brings a kind of joy you can't find anywhere else. When you partner with God's people for God's purposes, amazing things happen. Mike would say it this way, my guy Mike. You might recognize Mike. He's done a number of spoken words around here if you've been around here for a few years. Super talented guy. He actually said it this way, like, "Man, these are some of the people that are like, they're on the Mount Rushmore of my life." Like when he thinks about the people who have shaped him, the people who are like carved in stone and who he has become, that's how he characterized it. These are the people who are on the Mount Rushmore of my life. Let me just ask you again, who's on the Mount Rushmore of your life? Whose face, whose life has shaped you so much that you would carve their face in stone. They just say something important and deep about who you are and who you're becoming. These are the questions we're gonna wrestle with, not just today, but next week as well. Here's 3 quick questions that we're gonna shape up. 2 of them we'll do today. 1 we'll dive into next week. Here they are. In terms of who you're becoming, let me just ask, who are you becoming like? Who is ahead of you that you are watching closely enough, that you share enough proximity? You sit next to them either on an airplane or a cubicle or in your home or in your neighborhood or wherever it is. You are with them enough. You do things alongside. You get shoulder to shoulder enough that their life is what is like rubbing off on you. Maybe you've heard the expression in parenting and in education as well, more is caught than taught. Have you heard this? When you walk with someone, you catch a lot of who they are, for better or for worse. Who are you becoming like? In today's story, when we dive into Exodus 17 in here in just a minute, we're going to call that person Moses, one who is out in front of us, who is shaping who we're becoming. Now, the second question we're going to hold off till next week. Who are you becoming with? Who are some peers that you are journeying with, that you draw the best out of them and they draw the best out of you? Joshua and Caleb, we're going to look at them closely next week. We'll save that one, but here's the second question for today. Who is becoming like you? As I said, we're going to call that guy out in front of us, Moses, and the guy, we'll consider ourselves in the seat of Joshua at times, because Joshua is one who journeyed just behind Moses, 40 years in terms of age difference, but in terms of the impact and leadership of God's people, they were kind of lockstep, Joshua taking on so much of who Moses was. But then we're going to flip the script and ask, in whose life are you Moses and they're Joshua? Who are you just a step ahead of? Who is becoming like you? And are you excited about that? We've got 4 kids, and there are times I'm not excited about it. Can I get a parents? Where did you learn that? And they just stare at you. Dang it. Right? This is the kind of partnership we're going to explore. A couple weeks ago, we looked at how God created us from and for partnership. Last week, we talked about a sibling partnership and all that we can learn and how to stay united in that. This week, we're going to talk about Moses ahead of us and Joshua behind us. But here's how it all fits for any of you who are trying to find your way in God's direction. The partnerships we're talking about will help anyone and everyone in their relationships. That's just how God's truth works. But it, especially in the context we are after, is not just any old partnership, not just a great relationship that brings joy, not just a partnership that produces good things, but a partnership that's going after God's purposes with God's people. That God has a dream in mind for every single one of us. He's put inherent contribution in every single one of us, and he has put work out in front of us to turn the world right side up in his direction. The kind of work that should scare us just a little bit at how much he trusts us, right? That he would hand us the keys to that kind of car is crazy talk, but he does, and he promises to go with us. And so we're always imagining, God, what is the next thing you're calling us into? We said this last week. What's the thing God has invited you to do that you haven't done yet? That's the kind of purpose we're going after. And we just know that it's going to take people beside us, people in front of us, and it's going to affect people behind us. So that's what we're looking at today. I hinted at it a couple times. If you haven't found your way to Exodus 17, grab your Bibles, go to Exodus 17. If you don't have a Bible, on the back of the chair is a little QR code, or this one on the screen might help you. It'll take you to a website where the first 2 links will help. Number 1 is a Bible app. If you don't have a Bible, download that app. Totally free. We didn't make it. Somebody else did. Very usable, very great. Just grab it. We use the New Living Translation, NLT. It should stay at the top if you're finding your way to the right spot. Or you can click the second link, which is going to be my notes this week. Now, my notes are like totally off to the side, but this week I'm going to offer you 8 questions. And I know that it's impossible for you to keep track of 8 questions. So you might want to click on the teaching notes this week so you can screenshot them on your phone. Or you can take a picture of the TV or the screen here and crop me out because nobody needs that noise. But those 8 questions are going to matter. When we think about the Moseses in front of us, if we're Joshua, and if we're Moses and we think about the Joshuas behind us, I've got 8 questions that I just want to invite you into. Because I would submit that every single one of us, the life God has for us, has both of those sorts of people in it. A Moses in front of us, at least, and Joshua's behind us. And so I'm going to ask you some questions and encourage you to find those people in your life so that you might experience the joy that God has in partnership. Now, Exodus 17, I got to read you into the story for just a minute. If you really want to read the epic of Moses, and I encouraged you to do it last week, you really have to read the book of Exodus all the way through Leviticus, which is rough, Numbers, Deuteronomy, which is an epic recap, and then roll on into Joshua if you really want to catch all of this. So if you have a commute, throw it on audiobook on that app you just downloaded and soak up the whole story. It's a journey. But today, I'm just going to give you 4 windows of like quick snapshots of this relationship between Moses and Joshua. And I'm gonna invite every single one of us to sit in both seats each time, to consider if we're Joshua, who's Moses in front of us? And if we're Moses, who's Joshua just behind us? And I'm gonna give you a question every time. So I wanna encourage you, the whole goal of today is for you to reflect on and ask God, who are these people in this season of my life? You're gonna at times be prompted to encourage them or stir them up or invite them in, so make sure you hold on to those. By Exodus 17, here's what has happened. Moses has become 80 years old. God shows up and says, Moses, I'm gonna rescue my people and you're gonna be involved. He freaks out and he says, okay, take Aaron and Miriam and others along with you. And he goes to the world's superpower of the time and convinces him, with God's help, to release 2 million slaves out of Egypt, and they begin wandering their way through the desert. Egypt changes their mind, starts chasing them. God rescues them in an epic way. You got to read it. I don't have time. Just on the other side of this rescue, there's this huge celebration, but it wasn't long after the celebration, they turn their attention forward and find themselves in a battle. Exodus chapter 17, this is where we find it. By Exodus 17, Moses says this. I think I'm going to start in, wait, that's not it. Stand by. Yahtzee. Verse 9. Moses commanded Joshua, choose some men and go out and fight the army of Amalek for us. Tomorrow I will stand at the top of the hill holding the staff of God in my hand. The old guy tells the young guy, you go fight the battle, I'm going to sit up here. That's what that is in my translation. But there's a really important reason. This partnership that was being forged, you read in another part of the scripture that Joshua had been Moses' kind of sidekick, his aide for many years. By this moment in the story, Moses is probably early 80s and Joshua is likely early 40s. A man of influence, a man of character who had spent time side by side with Moses. And so when Moses needs somebody to do something pivotally important for the rescue of God's people, he calls on Joshua and says, Joshua, get some guys, go fight the battle, but I'm gonna be with you. And this is what he meant by I'll be with you in verse 10. He says, so Joshua did what Moses had commanded, and he fought the army of Amalek. Meanwhile, Moses, Aaron, and Hur climbed to the top of a nearby hill. As long as Moses held up the staff in his hand, the Israelites had the advantage. But whenever he dropped his hand, the Amalekites gained the advantage. Moses' arms soon became so tired he could no longer hold them up. So Aaron and Hur found a stone for him to sit on, and they stood on each side of Moses, holding up his hands. And so his hands held steady until sunset, and as a result, Joshua overwhelmed the army of Amalek in battle. Now, if you've been reading the kind of epic of Moses, Moses was like, God, how am I going to know you are with me? And he says, what's this staff in your hand? And this staff became a symbol of God's presence, not some kind of magic talisman that did anything on its own, just a symbol of trust, of Moses holding on to this like he was holding on to God's help. And it often became a symbol. And so when Moses would hold it up, it was like, God, we trust you. You're the only way this battle's gonna turn out the right way. It's not Joshua's strength. It's not his strategy. It's not the people he's recruited. It's not my leadership, Moses. It is this staff. It is God's help is the only way we are going forward. And so I just want you to see right out of the gate, 2 million people counting on 2 people partnering in deep trust of God. Not choosing to either ask God for help or act on his behalf, but to do exactly both at the same time. Joshua was in the valley offering all of his strength, fighting a battle that was as real as anything, and Moses on the mountain praying and entrusting all of this to God in a powerful way. If you're ever wondering, should I take action or should I pray? The answer is, guess what? Yes, both, right? Both. This is how God has designed us. Any of you finding your way toward Jesus, it's not God's gonna do it or I gotta do it. This is the story of the gospel, that he says, I'll live life with you. We'll put you back together. And so we rely on him and we act at the same time. It's what Walter Kaiser says, the blend of divine sovereignty and human responsibility. God invites us to be caught up in what he's doing. And so Joshua and Moses have an epic partnership in the middle of this. So here's your first set of questions. Don't lose your phone. If you want to hold on to these, snap a picture. In your life, with whom and for what are you offering your best energy? If you're Joshua, with whom and for what are you offering your very best energy? Joshua is in the prime of life at this point. Like he had enough grit and reputation to lead an army. He had enough youth to fight the battle. He was gonna bring the center of his being to bear on behalf of God's people. Let me just ask you, in whatever season of life you are in, where are you offering your very best energy? Everything around you will ask you to contribute it to achievement, acquisition, climbing the ladder, appearing great, developing a whole following, all kinds of stuff. Let me just ask you, what is the most meaningful thing that you could offer the best of your energy to? In any season of life, it might look a little bit different, but I'm just gonna submit that what God has invited you to is where you should offer your very best energy on behalf of others. This is what Joshua did. And he did it because someone ahead of him, a Moses ahead of him, helped him see where his contribution would have the greatest impact. And so if you're a Joshua, who's the Moses in your life, that alongside that person, you are offering your very best energy. Not what's left over after all the urgency of life, the best of your energy. And while we're at it, when you find yourself in the place of Moses and someone is behind you, some Joshua following your example, let me just ask, who senses your full, spirit-filled support? This is the beauty of the story of Exodus 17. Joshua was called by, sent into, and fully supported by Moses to make an essential contribution to what God was doing. We need Moses in our life to do that kind of thing. Who's a Moses in your life calling the best out of you in God's direction? And at the same time, if we imagine ourselves as Moses with Aaron and Hur on the top of the mountain, who is it that knows we've got their back? We're praying consistently for them. We are encouraging the best out of them. We've called them into something that matters. We need both of these kind of people in our life. That's story number one. Follow me to story number two. Oh, actually, let me just invite you to do this real quick. Who are the Moseses that come to mind? What are the names? I encourage you to start a little list on a piece of paper or in your phone and send yourself a text with a list of people who have represented Moses in your life. Who has called the best out of you and called you into the most important things? Make a Moses list. And while you're at it, who's behind you? Make a Joshua list. Who have you called the best out of and offered your full support to? Because by the end of today, I'm going to encourage you to send some texts, some letters, go to a meal, and stir those people's faith up like crazy. Keep a list of Moses and Joshua. Story number two, Exodus 33. Find your way there. It's just hang a right. Everything's in numerical order. It's super convenient. Exodus 33. Exodus 33 is this story kind of along the way. If Joshua and Moses had to kind of fight their way into the journey, this is a story characterizing how they walked that kind of journey. They found their way through the desert for 40 years because Moses makes a huge mistake, huge mistake. And a whole generation of people make a huge mistake. You got to read it. It shows up in Numbers, I think 13, 14, 15, somewhere along there. But they end up wandering through the desert for 40 years. God had something in mind, but they didn't trust him, and so he had to help them learn that along the way. Discipline is not pleasant at the time, but that's what they encountered. And along the way, we catch this story in Exodus chapter 33. In verse 7, it says this: it was Moses' practice to take the tent of meeting and set up some distance away from the camp. All right, so listen, I promised a guy around here I would do this. 2 million people journeying through the desert, and they were just basically camping their way through the desert. They had to pick up their food every single day because God had provided in a powerful way. They had no other way to provide. They didn't know where they were going. They were 40 years camping in the desert. Some would say it was intense. Someone just got it. Did you hear it? Okay. This tent was different though. Moses was like, there's a lot of noise in the middle of 2 million people, most of whom are complaining and they don't know where we're going and they're looking for Moses for where to go. And Moses was looking one place for where to go, and that was in God's direction. And so he had a tent that he would set up outside the camp to give God his full attention and say, God, what's next? What's next? Where are we going? What are we doing? What do I do? And that was this tent of meeting. Everyone who wanted to make a request of the Lord, it says in verse 7 or 8, that they would go to the tent of meeting outside the camp. Now, it describes this some more, and you have to read Exodus 33 and 34, two of my favorite chapters in the whole story of Moses. The way he interacts and hears from God, the way God is so delicate and like strong at the same time. He's so patient with Moses, but he's also so clear about who he is. It's rich. You got to read it, Exodus 33 and 34. But what I don't want you to miss is that in verse 11, it says this, inside the tent of meeting, the Lord would speak to Moses face to face as one who speaks to a friend. And afterward, which is mind-boggling. People they were 400 years in slavery. God rescued them out in this epic way. Like God humbled the world leader of the time with 10 plagues and wiped out their army with a simple lake. It was amazing. They were like, oh my goodness, this God. And Moses meets with him like a friend. Who gets to do that? But he did. And afterward, Moses would return to the camp, and the young man who assisted him, Joshua, this is our guy, Joshua, son of Nun, would remain behind in the tent of meeting. Listen, I just want you to catch this partnership between Moses and Joshua. Moses was so overwhelmed by what God had called him to do, he knew that he couldn't do even a day of it without God's help. But what I don't want you to miss is that Joshua saw that every day. Joshua was shaped by Moses' desire and dependence on God. If you read Exodus 33, you'll also see that Moses was not secretive about this. It was not private. He literally walked through the middle of camp, and people would come out from their tents to see, oh, that's our leader going to meet with God to figure out what the next step is. He was visibly depending on God. If you read it, you'll also find that Moses encounters God in such a way that something changes about his appearance that people are like, whoa, Moses has been with God, we better step back. Like we gotta leave some space for this. But Joshua, hungry for God's presence in the way that Moses experienced God's presence, he would just remain. He was like this shadow following Moses everywhere, taking on his way of life, which is a beautiful picture. Who's ahead of you that you're taking on? Your hunger for God is growing because of theirs. Who's behind you that your hunger for God is shaping theirs? Now, in the Old Testament, I just got to say this because we're reading a lot of stories. We're doing this whole series, this study. If you haven't grabbed a copy, you can grab it at the info center. We're watching these people who were journeying with God through the time of God's people before Jesus. Now, a lot changes in Jesus, and I just don't want you to miss this, so I got to take an aside really, really quickly. Moses set up a tent, and he was the one who would encounter God and hear from God and then convey what he would hear from God to the people so they would know what to do next. And this is how it worked before Jesus, that a few people at specific times for a specific purpose would get to encounter God. Now, God provided for all of them, and he led all of them, but he didn't interact with all of them. It was only with a few people at specific times for a specific purpose. But because Jesus paid for everything that could separate us from God, that released God to say, I can give my spirit to all of my people, all of the time, for all of God's kingdom purposes. That is a radical shift. Yes, absolutely. So there's never a moment in Jesus where we are without God. There's never a moment where if we identify with Jesus and acknowledge him as our Lord and Savior, the Spirit is alive in us, available to us, and everything we set our hands to in Jesus' name comes with his strength. Not a few people, a few of the times for a specific purpose, all of us, all of the time for all of God's kingdom purposes. And this is why in 2 Corinthians 3 is one of my favorite passages. I gotta say it real quick. Whenever someone turns to the Lord, the veil is taken away, is what it says in 2 Corinthians 3. You see what happened when Moses would come back from meeting with God is he would veil his face so people wouldn't freak out. And Paul says, listen, that was a symbol of God's presence in her life, but because of what God has done in Jesus, that veil is no longer necessary. For the Lord is the Spirit, and wherever the Spirit of the Lord is, there is freedom. And so all of us who trust Jesus have had the veil removed, and all of us who trust Jesus can both see and reflect the glory of the Lord. Listen, your calling is high. You are a royal priesthood, followers of Jesus. You are where God meets people and people meet God. The veil is no longer there. We can see and encounter God for ourselves, and we should be reflecting God to others. And it is the Spirit, the Lord who is the Spirit, makes us more and more like him as we are changed into his glorious image. If you're just trying to find your way toward Jesus and you're looking around at a bunch of jacked up people, you are seeing things right. Let me just affirm you, okay? But you are also seeing people who way different than a week ago, 2 weeks ago, a year ago, 2 years ago, because the Spirit is at work, making us more and more and more like him. And so you get shoulder to shoulder with us for a little while, you're just gonna see story after story where God meets us and helps us reflect him more and more. And that's the journey God invites you to. He won't do it all at once, he'll do it little by little with the help of his people around you. And he's patient, he's not in a hurry. He's not frustrated. He just walks the journey with us like 40 years across a desert. We get to do that kind of thing. It's not just Joshua, or it's not just Moses. So let me ask you 2 questions. Here's questions 3 and 4. You ready? If you're Joshua and there's a Moses ahead of you, who is it that you're spending time with because of their nearness to God? Who, like Joshua, do you stay in their shadow so the way they encounter God becomes the way you encounter God? Who creates a hunger in you for more of God's presence because of the way they live and experience God's presence? Put that person's name on your Moses list. Some of you don't have a very long list yet. We'll get to that in a little bit. And on the flip side, if you're Moses, who's behind you? Who is becoming more and more like him because they are near you? Who's around you enough? Who are you inviting close enough that they are seeing you become more and more like him by the power of the Spirit so they can have the same hunger along the way? Now, if you don't have people on your list, I just want to say, you need some people on your list. This is what God invited you to. I don't know how busy your calendar is. I don't know how fast you're going. I don't know how early you try to leave different places. I don't know where you leave marginal time, but just so you know, relationships develop in the margins. You can't schedule these kind of relationships. Joshua walked everywhere with Moses, found his way. The followers of Jesus spent time with him. How could you arrange your life? What would you have to start, stop, or modify to get next to some people who, when you catch what they're dropping, you're finding your way in the direction of Jesus? And who might you invite alongside you? Put them on your Joshua list that they would find what you have found, that you could hand them what you've been handed. There's some young guys around here who are living exactly this. There's some teenagers who they just show up everywhere. Like, pick your favorite sitcom from when you were little. You know the neighbor kid who just wanders in at unsuspecting times when people are like, why are you here? There's these amazing teenagers who just keep following our production crew around. And every single time we just like all the people who do all the sound and video and everything so you can see and hear, these guys are there. They're there every single time. Sometimes they're sent home because they're just here, okay? But let me just tell you, if you don't have Moses and Joshua in your life, you should follow their example. Because they're not just learning how to use a camera. They're not just learning how to do anything along the way. They were the ones. So they were the last people to leave. 2 of these guys and me were here with the last people to leave when there was water under this, when that huge rain came through. They were down there with wet feet, lifting up shop vacs full of water until there wasn't any water anymore, so you could sit in seats that weren't full of mold and must. Listen. But I just want you to know, they're not learning how to fix a flood, and they're not learning how to point a camera. They're catching what some pretty amazing people are handing them as they just get near them. If you're looking for a Moses in your life, don't ask Moses to stop going to the tent of meeting, and don't ask Moses to stop leading God's people. Go get where they are and do what they're doing, and watch what happens along the way. Window number 3 is in Numbers chapter 27. Head there right now. The third and fourth windows, I'm going to give you 4 questions fairly quickly, and these actually come from the same event. If we began with a battle at the beginning of the journey, and we just looked at how Moses regularly met with God over the course of the journey, this window is the end of the journey. And make no mistake, for all of us, there will be an end of the journey. what God has entrusted to us is only for a season. While he is forever, we are temporary. Can I get a right? And that's kind of a relief, honestly, right? Anyway, Moses in Numbers chapter 27, he says this. One day the Lord said to Moses, climb one of the mountains east of the river and look out over the land that I have given the people of Israel. Just pause. When you read the epic, you're going to know God promised them a place to thrive and live where when everyone looked at them, they would see how amazing their God is. It was called the promised land because it was promised, okay? And he's looking across a river and they're about to enter it. After you have seen it, Moses, you will die just like your brother Aaron. That's a pretty sobering sentence. For you both rebelled against my instructions in the wilderness, Zin. And when the people of Israel rebelled, you failed to demonstrate my holiness to them at the waters. That's a harsh moment for a 120-year-old man who spent the last 40 years of his life leading God's people out of captivity. But it was a promise God made, and it was a promise God would keep. And I just don't want you to miss this when you read this later. This is one of the passages from the study. If you do the shoulder-to-shoulder study with us, you'll see this. You'll look into this. I just want you to see, all of us are reminded at some point that what God hands us is only for a time. While it matters for all of eternity, and while it matters in our lives right now, and while it will shape who we are becoming, it is temporary. There will come a time where we will need to hand it to someone else. And while you're at it, I just want you to notice that Moses failed, and he failed big. And I don't want you to miss that Joshua saw it. It was a real gift when I sat with my 4 friends at a restaurant in Nashville that one of those guys said, Drew, you're on my Mount Rushmore. I hope you get that moment with someone. It's a sweet moment. But the truth is that anytime you put a human's face on Mount Rushmore, it's bound to crumble. And it would be really easy to not have Moses's in front of us because people have disappointed us. And it would be really easy, try not to have Joshua's behind us because we know us. I know me. I don't know how well you know you, but I'm getting to know me pretty well, and I'm pretty messed up at times. And it would be really easy to stay out of either of those seats because of the messed up nature of people, but the truth is that God's image is still in us. We can point in his direction, and the very best of us, even at our worst, can point people in God's direction. See, there's really only one person who belongs on Mount Rushmore, and it's no human. Right? It's God himself, or son Jesus, right? In verse 15, he goes on and says this, Then Moses said to the Lord, O Lord, you are the God who gives breath to all creatures. Please appoint a new man as a leader for the community. Give them someone who will guide them wherever they go and will lead them into battle so that the community of the Lord will not be like, catch this phrase, sheep without a shepherd. If you're a Bible reader and you love the life of Jesus, that phrase rings in your ears. If you read the Old Testament through the lens of Jesus, if you read the story of God, which was for thousands of years before Jesus arrives, you'll see Jesus everywhere. Jesus would use this very phrase about himself. He looked across the people and he had compassion on them. This is Matthew chapter 9. Because he saw that they were harassed and helpless, like sheep without a shepherd. Anybody know anybody looking for the way forward and just can't seem to find it? Anybody think they've found it, but you're just watching, knowing that there's a moment coming that the thing they've decided to build their life on is going to crumble? This is what Jesus looked across, and he did not look with judgment or impatience. He looked with compassion and kindness because they were harassed and helpless like sheep without a shepherd. He would go on in John chapter 10 and say, I am the good shepherd. Jesus said, let me lead. And this is what makes us followers of Jesus. Not that we perform perfectly or have all the right answers. We've just found a really great shepherd. We've found someone who can point us in the very best way all the time, who leads us to thriving, right? And so I just want to encourage you, a little side note, little bonus scripture, grab a picture of this, Matthew chapter 9 and John chapter 10. Just watch for sheep and shepherd and watch how Jesus is the one who is the only one who belongs on our Mount Rushmore. And any tour guide or any field guide along the way should only point us in his direction. Well, God answers this question in verse 18 and says, the Lord replied, well, here's who your leader's going to be. Guess who? Joshua, the one who has walked for 40 years by your side and offered his best. Not because he earned it and not because of longevity. Here's why he chose Joshua. Because he has the Spirit in him. And then I want you to lay your hands on him. In my mind, this is like a change of command out at the base where the standard is handed from one person to the next, a very clear transfer of leadership. It says, present him to Eleazar the priest, who before the whole community and publicly commission him to lead the people. Transfer some of your authority, he says to him, so that the whole community of Israel will follow him, will obey him. Now, leadership lessons here abound. So if you're a leadership person, you should absolutely read the last 4 or 5 chapters of Deuteronomy. Pick up everything you can from God's character. But here's what I want to do today in our partnership. You've been making a list of Moseses ahead of you. And if that's true and you're Joshua, let me just ask you, who is commissioning you to God's work? I'm sure there are supervisors and bosses that see good in you, that are commissioning you to the success of the organization. And that's not inherently bad. I bet there are coaches who look at you and your contribution to the team, and they're commissioning you to more gear, more practice, more influencing, promising, more innings, more reps, more rounds, more touches, or whatever along the way. I'm sure there are people who are inviting you and commissioning you to things that are just fine, but my question is not that. My question is, who is commissioning you? Who is looking at you and saying, I see in you what God put in you, and is calling you into the things that God is up to in your neighborhood, in your workplace, in your family, in your life. Those are the things that last. Listen, I got to lead at a church for a number of years, but when I sat down with those boys at that table in Nashville, it wasn't the programs that were built, the trips that were led, the t-shirts that were printed, or any of that stuff. That was all just context. What lasts is the influence we have on the life of an individual. And so who is it that is having that influence on you? Who is commissioning you, calling you, stirring you up into God's work? Someone who says, I see this in you, or we see this in you. Put them on your Moses list. You need to send them a thank you text very soon. We'll get to that in a moment. And while I'm at it, who's been watching you? If you're Moses and they're Joshua, who's on your Joshua list? Who are you handing what God has handed you? Who are you transferring some of your wisdom, authority, influence, inviting them alongside? You see, it was a 17-year-old kid who shot the video last week, and he looked so nervous, but it was great. Just finding his way. Who are the Moseses ahead of you? Who are the Joshuas behind you? You see, the beauty is all of us have been called into this, and when you look at Matthew chapter 9 later this week, Matthew chapter 9, Jesus said they were like a sheep without a shepherd. And so do you know what he says next? He says the harvest is plentiful, meaning there are all kinds of people who could come alive in Jesus. The harvest is plentiful, but then he says this, the workers are few. And so ask the Lord of the harvest to send out workers, ambassadors, agents like Moses who go in God's name to do God's work and call people alive in God's direction. This is who we are, followers of Jesus. This is who we're becoming. We don't want to just be followers of Jesus. We make followers of Jesus. We don't want to just be disciples. We want to make disciples. We don't just live and enjoy the story God's writing in our life. We share that story with others, and we tell the story of God calling other people alive in him. I just want to say, you are commissioned in the most important work possible, followers of Jesus. When you go and commission, I'll offer you this last passage quickly because you'll study it more later this week. In Deuteronomy 31, this is what commissioning sounds like. Moses called for Joshua, and as all of Israel watched, he said to him, be strong and courageous. Can I just tell you, be strong and courageous. Not because you're strong and courageous, but because he is with you. He goes on and he says, for you will lead these people into the land that the Lord swore to their ancestors, who will divide it among them as their grant of land. Do not be afraid or discouraged. When God calls you in to do something that makes you just a bit nervous or just a bit afraid, like last week, reach for him and reach for people around you. But most of all, listen, don't be afraid or discouraged, for the Lord will personally go ahead of you. He will be with you. Our first partner is always him. He will neither fail you nor abandon you. God has work ahead for you, and he promises this, I'll go with you, and I'll surround you with great people as you go. And so listen, if you're Joshua and Moses is ahead of you, who is it that speaks like this in your world? Who looks at you and in their own words says, be strong and courageous? You need these people. I need these people. I don't have time, but I could tell you about my dad. I can tell you about Bart Shaw. I can tell you about Matt Reagan. I can tell you about Joel Craig. I can talk about Kevin Oder, Mitch Harrison. I can talk about Paula Mitchell and any others that, listen, I just would not be who I am without them at moments reminding me. I can tell you about Doug Parks, who in their words, at the right time, in a way that mattered because I was in proximity to them, had the privilege and had earned the right to say, Drew, be strong and courageous. God is with you, and so are we. And we keep going. You need Moses in your life. Who is Moses in your life? Who will speak things that echo in your ears for decades? That 15, 17 years from now, you sit down over some amazing turkey and brie sandwich in Nashville, Tennessee, and get to tell them you mattered in that moment. I heard God in your voice in that moment. You need Moses in your life. Do you have a Moses list? And I just hope you have the privilege to sit down with someone in your life who's a Joshua, who looks you in the eye and says, at the right time, I heard God's voice in your words. If you're Moses and there's a Joshua behind you, who will have more courage because of what God is saying in their life through you? Listen, the only way you find the kind of joy of these partnerships is to get next to these kind of people. If you don't have a Moses in your life, here's what I would encourage you to do. Find a way to place your very best energy in what God is doing and watch for Moses around you. Don't ask him to stop, just join what they're doing. And if you haven't yet taken time to look around behind you and call Joshua's, if you don't have a long Joshua list, I just encourage you to begin praying and asking God, who are the people you have afforded me influence with that I could invite just a little bit closer, that when I go to the tent of meeting, they come with me, that when we go into battle, I call them to our side. It's that kind of legacy that when I sit with people at the memorials of their life that they celebrate, right? That people just honor and express such deep kind of gratitude. And that reveals how much this matters. You see, Moses, I gave you this outline last week. Moses spent 40 years thinking he was somebody early in his life, and he wasted a whole bunch of time, came to an utter moment of failure, found himself walking into obscurity for the next 40 years, learning that he was a nobody. But the beautiful thing was, at just the right time, God showed up, invited Moses into his work, and demonstrated exactly, spent the next 40 years finding out exactly what God can do with a nobody. I'm just saying, God has purpose in mind for you. And you need some Moses ahead of you to call you into it. And God has purpose in mind for you that you might call alive some Joshuas just a step behind you. It's not for later. It's not for when you grow up or when you get over that next hill. It's for today. It's for now. It's in the midst of what you are doing. It's not for when you can finally manage to get retired to retirement, or when you finish this round of school, or when you get to that next career. It's for right now. And by the way, if you've hit those seasons of life, Moses was 120 when he handed this kind of thing off. If you're not dead, you're not done. You have contribution to make. You have people to learn from, and you have people who need to learn from you. And so you need Moses in your life, and you need Joshua in your life to get shoulder to shoulder with some great people who you can receive from and contribute to. Because in the middle of all this, God has amazing joy and formation for you and for them. You will see and behold and reflect the Lord's glory in your life by the Spirit alive in you and in them. Whatever you may have messed up along the way, you are not disqualified. Moses screwed up right and left. And by the way, I don't care how busy you are not excused. God has good in mind for you. And so if you don't have some Moses, get some Moses. If you don't have some Joshua, get some Joshua. If you've been distracted running after good things instead of great things, things that last forever, I just encourage you, start, stop, and modify anything that you can, because God has good in mind with you and for you and these people around you. So we asked a bunch of questions worth reflecting on this week. Make sure you click on the notes to get an extra copy of those and spend some time talking with God. We want to put ourselves around people we can follow and make sure we're leaving space for people to follow us in God's direction. If we can support you in any way, don't hesitate to reach out. You can head over to canyonridge.org where you'll find everything you need to know, along with a way to get in touch with us. If this was helpful or encouraging to you, I encourage you to pass it on to someone else, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button. We'll see you soon.